quick questions. And Denis,
bien. Je voulais tout d'abord vous remercier d'être ici présent aujourd'hui. Je ne reviendrai pas sur le cadrage politique en fait, puisque Vike vient de le faire. Je voudrais seulement insister sur ce projet, en fait, le projet Arte en tant que tel, chaîne franco-allemande, mais également chaîne européenne, qui me paraît une des réalisations en fait emblématiques consécutives à la signature du traité donc, de l'Élysée entre le général de Gaulle et Konrad Adenauer.
Varbūt atļaujiet uzsvērt šī televīzijas kanāla Arte to milzīgu lielo nozīmi un tieši pastāstīt vairāk par to, kas ir tapis pēc tam, kad tātad ģenerālis de Gaulle un Vācijas kanclers Adenaueris tātad parakstīja Elizējas līgumu.
Il y a en effet donc de nombreux traités bilatéraux qui sont signés, mais qui parfois ne sont pas suivis des faits. Nous avons là pour le coup un exemple concret d'une réalisation dans un domaine particulier, à savoir la culture et les médias, qui trouve toute sa légitimité et qui effectivement peut servir le cas échéant de modèle dans d'autres domaines.
Atgriežoties pie priekš teiktā, Arte tātad nav tikai divu kultūru kanāls, bet tas ir pārgājis šīs te divu kultūru kanāla robežas, un tas ir kļūst par Eiropas kanālu. Bet ja mēs runājam par starpvalstu līgumiem, protams, daudzi tādi ir parakstīti, bet tik tiešām reti, kurš varbūt ir tādu atbalstu kultūras jomu.
Je voudrais remercier bien entendu l'ambassade d'Allemagne d'avoir été, je dirais, dès le départ nos partenaires. Nous avons travaillé ensemble. C'est également une des manifestations à notre échelle, bien entendu, donc, du traité franco-allemand des années plus tard.
Jā, un vispirmām kārtām liels paldies Vācijas vēstniecībai, ar kur mēs tiešām plec pie pleca esam šo te programmu izveidojuši.
Madame Brikš, bien entendu, sans qui cette intervention n'aurait pu avoir lieu.
Paldies tev Brikšs kundzei, bez kuras tātad arī šie te pasākumi, šī te nedēļa nevarētu būt iespējama.
Professeur Hahn, bien entendu.
Paldies arī liels profesoram Hahn.
Et Monsieur Vazak.
Protams, liels paldies arī Vazak.
Et je vais vous faire des confidences, en fait, quand j'étais jeune, maintenant, mais je regardais Arte quasiment tous les soirs et j'avais la chance, effectivement, donc, de voir Monsieur Vazak à la télévision. Et si on m'avait dit un jour que j'aurais l'occasion d'inviter Monsieur Vazak, que Monsieur Vazak répondrait favorablement, je me serais pincé pour le croire. Donc vraiment, merci infiniment.
Nu jā, varbūt atļaujiet mums tā pastāstīt par savu personīgo pieredzi, jo viņš saka, tad, kad es biju jauns, nu varbūt drīzāk jaunāks, tad es katru vakaru skatījos Artes programmas un tajās, protams, es jāsaka, īpaši tās programmas, kuras veidojas žurnālists Vazaks, un ja man kādreiz dzīvē būtu teicis, ka man būs iespējams ar viņu tikties un uzaicināt uz Rīgu, jāsaka, nu es nebūtu ticējis, ja, tātad varētu teikt, ka viņa varbūt jaunības, jāsaka, tāds augs ir šeit.
Bien entendu, je remercie Anne d'avoir accepté de faire la modération.
Paldies arī Roškāns kundzei, piekrīt arī, jāsaka, piedalīties šajā diskusijā.
Merci infiniment et bon séminaire, bons travaux.
Jā, liels paldies un lai jums labs seminārs šodien.
Et merci à Dita pour la traduction.
Es mēģināju izturēt.
okay, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay.
Really much fond of ex-cathedra lectures, but I really would like to have it interactive. So whenever you have a question, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Whenever you have a comment, good or bad, please interrupt me. Be interactive. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Oliver Hahn. I'm a professor of journalism at the University of Passau. But I'm not only an academic. I worked as a journalist, especially a news journalist in the German-French context for more than 15 years. Basically for Euronews, which maybe you know, it's a European news channel, not only in French and German, but in many other languages. I worked for Arte also quite a long time for the French and German newswire service of Agence France-Presse. What I would like to give you in my short presentation is kind of theoretical background, why there are different approaches of journalism culture, why there are different communication systems. And I think the German-French example is very impressive because we are very close neighbors on the landscape. We are only separated by the River Rhine. But sometimes I have the feeling that the communication systems go swimming into the Rhine because they are so different. So let me try to give you some theoretical background which comes from cultural anthropology and which is really old. Maybe not in my eyes, but maybe in your eyes, which dates back to the 50s of the last century and which has been updated quite a long time and which is also very actual and punctual in case, very timely today. So let me ask you a question. Media globalization, what would you think? Is it a myth or is it true? No idea? Maybe media globalization is in somehow true and somehow not true. Why in somehow true? Because on the organizational level, on the economic, on the business level, of course we have media globalization channels in all over the world. Take the example of Rupert Murdoch and other moguls in the media scene. But when it comes to journalism, I think media globalization really is a myth. Why? Because journalism is very sensitive to cultural and linguistic context. And it's always represented by these contexts. This is what we call contextual objectivity. And I will give you the theoretical background now. So there has been one man who is very important. Maybe I can write him down on this whiteboard. And his name, maybe it's known to diplomats, it's Edward T. Hall. Have you ever heard about him? No? So he used to be a cultural anthropologist in the United States. He died only in 2009, so he was very old in the end, married for 8 times. Footnote. And what he invented was what we call the intercultural communication research. And he did not focus on mass media. He firstly focused on interpersonal communication, on face-to-face communication, on human communication. And he bequeathed a very interesting scientific testament. And this is kind of tautology, which is culture is communication and communication is culture. So always communication is reflected by the culture, and also journalism is reflected by the culture. Why? Because journalism or communication is not operating in hermetically sealed spaces, but is always operating within a context of a culture, of a society, and which is also in the context of national history, sometimes also regional history or local history. So what was this man, Edward T. Hall? He was one of the first teachers of the new diplomat schools in the United States that is until today running, which is called the Foreign Service Institute. The Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C., in the State Department, has been introduced only in '46, so right 1 year after World War II. Why? Because at that time, the US-American Congress reformed the Foreign Service Act. And why did they reform that law? Because there have been other people from other parts of the world saying that US diplomats behave so badly and do not behave according to the mentalities and according to the societies where they have to work. And they wanted to reform that, and one of the teachers of the very first hour was Edward T. Hall, because he did more than 30 years of research in intercultural communication, empirical research, because he observed, he interviewed, and he analyzed how people in day-to-day communication behave in different countries. At that time, we have to admit that they say culture is equal nation. Today, of course, we know that it is not true, that we cannot say culture is nation. But at that time, they had this premise. So the premise is that journalism cultures are always reflecting, and media are always reflecting, how people behave and communicate with each other. This is the classical way of having interpersonal communication and then mass media communication. And what this Edward Hall did is he analyzed three things. He analyzed the understanding of time. Different people have time, what he is called chronemics. And he analyzed, secondly, the understanding of space people do have in communication, which is proxemics. And third and lastly, he analyzed the information context people in different countries do have. What does that mean? Chronemics, the understanding of time. He found out that there are some cultures and some communication systems and journalism systems that have a different understanding of time, meaning that time is for some countries, for some communication systems, rather relative. No? Be punctual or not, who cares? And in other cultures, time has an absolute value. I come to the example of art later. When I remember the very beginnings of art, there has been a big discussion when the prime time in the evening should start. Why? Because in Germany, for example, the prime time in the evening, when everybody sits in front of the television set, starts at 8:15. Why a 8:15? Because the most important newscast is on the first public channel, which is Radošā, called, and that runs from 8 o'clock until 8:15. And after that, people are going to watch movies, are going to watch documentaries, sports editions, and so on and so forth. Whereas in France, for example, La Grande Messe, the newscast shows, also oftentimes start at 8 but run until 9 or 8:45, or sometimes only 20 minutes to 9. So it's not just fixed, you know, like the German case. So a cooperating channel. So when should artists start the prime time? Should it adopt to the German context? Should it adopt to the French context? Not losing one or the other public. It is also reflected by interpersonal behavior that there is a difference of understanding of time between France and Germany. I can tell you from my own experience, my mom is French, my father is German. When they first learned each other, my mom, the family of my mom invited him for dinner. And they say, could you please be there at around 8:30 or something? And my father, who didn't understand really much French and didn't know the context, he was punctual. He came there at 20:30. Of course, what happened? The family of my mom was still in the kitchen. So now what happened in Germany, if you are invited at a certain point of time, you should be punctual. Because if you come half an hour later for dinner, they have only served dessert. So it is an understanding of everyday life communication that is very much difficult. I know that sometimes there are cliches and stereotypes in it. But the problem with stereotype is that there is always a true nucleus, but everything was in the periphery is legend. So, but there is a true nucleus. So when my mom and my father learned each other and had more often dinner together, they did some intercultural lapses. Because my mother said, okay, I have to be punctual when I go to the family's dinner. So she went there to be punctual. But what happens to the German part of my family? They said, okay, she's French, let's be more relaxed and have dinner half an hour later. The same is true in the other direction. You know, when my father came to my mom's house, he said, okay, I have to be late. Don't worry. And so on. And they were punctual at that time. So coming to mass media, it has also been, I mean, these are only case examples. I can only give you in this short time case examples. There was this huge discussion of when should the prime time start in order not to lose one German or one French spectator of the audience. Now, what happens to proxemics, the understanding of space? There are cultures, according to Edward Hall, that avoid proximity. And there are other cultures, they don't avoid proximity. For example, when I first went to Arab countries, because this is also one of my expertises in the Arab world, I took a public bus to go. And I was standing like this, because it was so much crowded. And I was not feeling really well, because people came too close. I don't like that when people came too close, when you even can't really focus them. Because I'm from a bilingual and bicultural context, but I have lived a long time in Germany as well, and I know that people keep distance in Germany. And what Edward Hall found out, a very simple thing, is how people say hello to each other when they first met. In Germany, for example, we shake hands. I give you my hands. What happens is I'm kind of distance keeping, especially when it comes to a professional context. In France, on fait la bise. Kiss is right, the whole system, I would say, how to say hello to somebody. So they are not that much distance keeping. And when I come to media systems and I compare how journalists work in France and how they are trained in France and how journalists, for example, are trained in Germany, this proximity thing is quite reflected to their relations to politicians. Because in France, oftentimes, journalists are very close to politicians. Maybe it's also a reason because France is a very centralized country and everything happens in Paris, except Arte in Strasbourg. But they are very close. Whereas in Germany, when you go to a journalism school or learn it at the university, the first thing you learn is be distant. Be distant to politicians, be distant, be neutral. Sometimes it's a nightmare. I mean, I know that also not many journalists are too much distant to politicians. But this is a basic fact that, especially in Germany, right after World War II, we kind of introduced the Anglo-Saxon model of journalism, which is basically saying that there should be a kind of fourth estate. The press should be the fourth estate in Germany. Whereas in France, when I went to the journalism school in Paris, the first thing I learned, le journaliste est le médiateur entre le public et la politique. A mediator between politicians and public is something a bit different than I would say the fourth estate. Although today there are tendencies also in France saying contre-pouvoir, which is a kind of counterpower to journalists. But this distance thing is also reflected not only by the mass media, but has its basics in interpersonal everyday life communication. The third one is, to my opinion, the most important. That is the information context. And there Edward Hall did some research about how people inform themselves. And he made a difference between two tendencies in cultures. First of all, there are cultures that prefer to inform themselves by their own surroundings. Family, friends, rather direct communication. Whereas there are other cultures, they have an information context, they don't do so much information exchange by personal relationships and so on, but more indirectly via media. So they don't have this very close relation. Have you ever been to Italy? No. Have you been in the evening, in the summer, in a beautiful piazza? How people communicate there? They speak British Arabic. I'm not astonished or surprised that in Italy, from the very beginning of mobile communication, everybody at least had 2 or 3 cell phones. So they communicate with each other in a direct way because for them and for many Mediterranean countries, by the way, it is very important to have an information context which is very direct to your relatives, to your friends. Whereas in more northern European countries, for example, you will find out that people prefer to communicate and inform themselves more indirectly by the media. I was very much astonished when I first went to Finland, to Helsinki. I don't know a single word of Finnish. I had an appointment, a meeting at the University of Helsinki. My hotel was a little bit far away, so I had to take the bus. Again, bus is very much important as experience. I stepped in the wrong bus, sitting there with school kids. Very early in the morning, around 6:30 a.m. And what these kids did was reading newspapers. I was shocked. Have you ever been to a German school bus? I would say nobody reads newspapers. Maybe today they have some tablet computers and inform themselves and so on and so forth. So basically you can say the difference between these cultures, distance avoiding, distance keeping, allowing closeness or not allowing closeness, informing indirectly or directly. If you look at the European landscape, you will find countries, rather in the north, that are so-called low-context cultures. And when you go more to the south, to the Mediterranean, oftentimes coined by Catholicism, you will find what they called high-context cultures. What does that mean? Low-context cultures avoid proximity. They have a very close understanding of time, and they inform themselves rather indirectly. Whereas in these high context cultures you have the completely opposite. And what is very interesting of this theory is to avoid stereotypes and cliches, it's an open-end scale. And this is what we call cultural relativism. That means we can only understand one communication culture by comparing it to another. The opposite would be called cultural essentialism. Essentialism means the French are as such, the Germans are as such, and so on and so forth. But relativism means you have to compare it. And it's an open-end scale, so that Edward Hall said, well, there are countries, they tend more towards high context cultures, or they tend more towards low context cultures. And if you look on the landscape, you will find France, for example, rather in the high context culture sense, like other Mediterranean countries like Italy, Spain, the Arab world, and so on, whereas Germany is more located in the low context cultures. But again, cultural relativism. It's not saying that Germany is a low context culture. It's not saying that France is a high context culture, but France is a high context culture in comparison to Germany. And the other way is also true. If you look at other countries, for example, Arab countries, I don't want to generalize all Arab countries, but many of the Arab countries are, in comparison to France, more a high context culture. Yeah? And for example, Scandinavian countries, are at the other end of the scale. Now it's up to you to decide where you will find Latvia. But I would guess, according to Edward Hall, you will find it rather here, as a low context culture. And whenever you have a look how mass media are reflecting these communication systems, you will get an understanding on how journalism cultures work. I will give you more examples from Germany and France television, not only from Arte, because Arte is something like in between, is the experiment of maybe trying to find out a syncretic hybrid journalism culture. Whereas I really like Arte, but I'm also a very severe critic of Arte, that you will find out, or in my opinion you will find out, even if the programs are translated, synchronized, dubbed to the other language, that I would say I need 30 seconds to find out whether the author is French or German. Because the journalism approaches again, do not operate in hermetically sealed spaces, but they cooperate and operate in the context of the communication that is reflected by interpersonal culture. Again, an example from Germany and France, news shows or newscasts in the evening. The Tagesschau in Germany, which again is in terms of viewers, regularly viewers, the most important newscast in the evening. This is the thing between 8 and 8:15. They say they have an average of 10 million viewers a night. This is a bit marketing by the ARD. I would say as a researcher it's rather 8 million. But again, it's still the most important newscast in German television. Disregarding that there are so many competitors from the private area, that there are new channels and so on and so forth. Still, Germans are very conservative when it comes to newscasts in the evening. So how is this emission structured? It is even reflected by chronemics and proxemics. In Germany, for example, if this is the screen, in the Tagesschau, there is a speaker, and this speaker is a kind of anonymous unperson, I would say. He's really anonymous. Even if you ask spectators, give me some names of these news readers, I would call them, yeah? They cannot remember such. They remember more names by, entertainment moderators, animators, and so on and so forth. So this person, I'm not really good in sketching, so please, yeah? He is sitting here at the table, or she, and here is what we call an insert. Insert means it's a photo or it's a graph of the news. Yeah? Why is it as such? It is intendedly done like this. Why? Because according to chronemics, proxemics, and information context, what the television viewer should read, quote unquote, first place is the news and not the person. So the person is kind of, again, anonymous unperson. Whereas, for example, we have a news journal, also an ARD, which comes a bit later in the evening, which is called Tagesthemen, which is a moderated journal. You have the exact other way round. Why? Because a moderator or an animator in this newscast can have an own opinion. And so he is read, quote unquote, first place. Now I can tell you, I went for the first time to Cairo some 15 years ago, I would say, and I watched for the first time Al Jazeera Arabic. And I said, okay, according to Edward T. Hall, it should be in high context culture, and it should be the other way around. People should read first from the person and then the news. But then, of course, stupid as I was, because at that time I couldn't that much speak Arabic, the reading direction of Arabic is in the exact opposite way. So now when we compare it to French newscasts, oftentimes in France, the most important newscasts in the evening, be that private commercial, be that public service, most of the times you have the presentator in the middle, and maybe you have a little insert on that side. Which means that is also reflecting the communication style, because in France they do not make this huge difference between who should you read first and who should you read next. Yeah. So again, the journalist, the French presentator, is very close to the public. I'm oftentimes very much astonished how close they are. Ask people in France, give me 5 names of the most important French moderators of the newscast. They could name them all. One of the most famous was PPDR, Patrick Poivre-Lavaux, who was at that time working for TF1, and who frauded an interview with Fidel Castro. He said he interviewed in person Fidel Castro, but it was a fraud. So he was editing kind of archive material and so on and so forth. And he was still in power after that scandal. I wonder whether that could happen in Germany. I think if somebody frauded such an interview and so on in the most important newscast in the evening, that was the end of the journalistic career. Also, what is very much interesting in comparison French and German journalism is that in France, for example, historically speaking, journalist comes from literature. And I'm not very much surprised that many French journalists still write books and sell them for good marketing reasons. And again, I'm not very much surprised that German foreign correspondents working in France, when they come back to Germany, they write books as well. Because they are so much in this news culture. Why is it as such? In France, journalism derives from literature, has been in the very beginning only weakly professionalized. So it was not considered to be a known profession, but part of a writer's profession. For example, maybe you have heard about him. His name was Zola, Emile Zola. And he published in the Dreyfus scandal an editorial which was titled J'accuse, I'm accusing, where he really socially and did part and engaged himself to free this man that was accused of treaty. So there is in France journalism, there is oftentimes a mix between facts on the one hand and opinion on the other hand. Whereas in Germany, the first thing you will learn when you go to journalism school is again the Anglo-Saxon model. You have to separate facts and opinion. And I'm also not very much astonished that in French newspapers everything is analyse. They don't have this genres of text that we do have in German journalism. Comment on the one hand, and news-oriented or fact-oriented content on the other hand. Again, some interesting example when it comes to journalism culture, and when working for newsrooms that are bicultural or even multicultural, is the consensus of what is news and what not. So I would say when it comes to international news, happenings, events that are very much distant to, in that case, France and Germany, there is consent. Would you agree? I mean, reporting about the Middle East conflict, for example, from the perspective of a French or a German journalist, I would say it is pretty much the same. But when it comes to domestic affairs, I witnessed that there is a huge discussion of what is news and what not. Now the French-speaking person must help me. I remember we did some news and reportage about the German Pflegeversicherung, which somehow was in France at that point not really much interesting. So I know the word in France, it's assurance pour les personnes gravataires. I have no clue how to translate it in English. It's an assurance for people that need help because of their age. It was so difficult for the German journalists doing this news item to explain to the French colleagues what does that mean, what is the whole context. You need to tell a French audience that is not that much into the issue that Germans. And again, journalism is in space and time very much limited. News in a television cast is something between 30 and 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes or so. How to explain to a French audience, first of all, what assurance pour les personnes gravataires is, what does that mean for the Germans, why there is the discussion. You need a lot of background, but you have only, let's say, 90 seconds. Other way around is also true. I remember that we tried to explain to the German audience what the famous la rentrée means for French people. La rentrée, when summer holidays are ending, life is going on, and when everybody comes back, that is a kind of social event, I would say. But again, there, for German audiences, for German context, you need lots more information, background information, and so on and so forth. So again, my hypothesis is when it comes to domestic issues, it's very difficult to have a common, a joint, a syncretic or hybrid journalism culture. And on the other hand, for example, it is easier to have these kind of international perspectives that are equally distant to each other. Now also when, again, analyzing Arte, it's very much interesting that all these is not only reflected by journalism content, but also by media aesthetics, how media is designed. For example, I remember in the very first beginning of Arte, they had a very interesting screen design that was done by a famous screen designer called Martin Lemley-Nern from Great Britain. He did screen designs for lots of channels, and it was very ludic. It was playing with images, it was playing with sound, something that for many French spectators of the French audience was very normal. But the Germans say, what is that? That is very, that is new to us. It's very aesthetic, but we don't consider it to be serious. Why? Because news have to be serious in Germany. Full stop. Because of this anonymous news reader that is in the Tagesschau, in the important newscasts. They also had a very interesting station voice. Do you know what station voice is? It's the voice that identifies the channel for the spectator, announcing programs that are upcoming, coming next, coming nows. So there needs to be a voice that that you recognize, that you remember, for marketing reasons. And the French first voice was the lady that was talking, in a very sexy way. Ex-show baby, this kind of strange telephone sex numbers, voice style. Whereas in Germany you have this what the French sometimes call this tank language, a very rough speaker announcing the program in a very serious way. The French say it's too pedagogical, and we don't like that, and so on and so forth. It's, by the way, not only reflected these kind of interesting different journalism cultures by television channels, but it's also reflected by magazines and newspapers. Very nice example I found is there is a magazine called Autobild in German, which belongs to the Bild-Zeitung, which is the most important popular newspaper in Germany. And this Autobild means they have a special issue only on cars, because Germans are in somehow fascinated with cars. And what comes now is that this newspaper, Autobild, was exported to France. It's a so-called transfer title. That's a management idea of print media, to transfer a magazine to another country, not doing translations, but having an own newsroom in that country that works on the same information the other newsroom have, but try to adopt it to the context, to the communication context of the country. So I found a very interesting article in Autobild some years ago. It was presented the new Porsche. And the headline was very factual in Germany, saying the new Porsche has more than 200 PS HP. Very factual. And I looked at the French version, which is not called Autobild, but Auto Plus in France. And for those of you who know French, all the car brands are feminine. La Porsche, La Mercedes. And the headline was, La nouvelle Porsche est la plus érotique au monde. The new Porsche is the most erotic car in the world. But then the text was nearly exactly based on the same information. But it has been adopted to a communication system that maybe in France cars have to be stylish, whereas in Germany cars have to be very technical and secure and so on. And there is also some irony when they do advertising. For example, I remember a television spot by Renault. They try to sell Renault cars on the German market. They know that the Germans are somehow fascinated by security, and they did this really nice television spot saying that, you know, a 2 days old baguette can avoid an accident, in contrast to a Weisswurst from Bavaria that will explode immediately when it is clashing with the car. So on the one hand, when it comes to media aesthetics, also to advertising and so on, we have, again, a very much more design-oriented way of doing it in high-context cultures, to which, in comparison to Germany, France belongs. And we have a more, let's say, very factual-oriented, being quote-unquote serious news design, very cold news design in Germany. Given all these, again, only case studies, only examples, but how can you do a television program together when coming from such different communication backgrounds? And what is interesting for a researcher is, again, whether to ask, are there moments of international journalism? Are there moments of multilingual journalism? Are there moments of bicultural, syncretic, hybrid journalism? When do they upcome, and when are there moments of this kind of pure journalism cultures? And there's also an interesting, more, let's say, abstract question that derives out of this is whether it is possible to have a European public sphere. Is it possible for a channel like Arte or other transcultural channels to address different audiences, and by doing so creating or help emerging a common European public sphere? And that is an answer, this is a research question. I don't have an answer so far. What I can only observe is that today in Europe there are different public spheres in the plural. That there is no common joint public sphere in the Habermasian sense of the word. I don't know if you ever dealt with public service, public opinion and public sphere theory, like Jürgen Habermas, for example. I have no clue until now if a common European public sphere is possible via media. And I know Arte, for example, in the inter-state treaty, in the preamble says that Arte has to help the understanding of people, common understanding of people. I'm not quite sure whether a television channel is able to do that. But witnessing what happened in the media landscape globally, we will find more and more attempts that, especially when it comes to TV, not speaking about social media and social network, that would be the next step, how they could create a common bicultural, bilingual, or multicultural, intercultural public sphere. When you look, for example, at international television channels, most of them started globally, but then quickly find out that does not work. CNN, for example. When CNN became prominent because of the live broadcast from Baghdad in the Second Gulf War from 90 to 91, they started right out of Atlanta. Nobody knows CNN at that time, even not inside the USA. They even said it's not CNN, it's Chicken Noodle Network. But then CNN became more and more prominent because of this live broadcasting. And then they quickly find out we have to localize ourselves. I don't know if you ever heard the term globalization. It's a linguistic contraction between globalization and localization. Maybe you know it from advertisement where it says, think global, but act local. which also reflects this contextual objectivity, saying, okay, you can have a global strategy, but you have to adopt it to local or national markets. So CNN is the perfect example of localized news channels. They started on an international level with the idea of having an American program everywhere in the world. Then they found out that does not work. So they localized themselves. They introduced CNN Europe, which is based in London. They introduced CNN en Español for Latin America. They even have CNN in Turkish. So they adopt to the local markets. Same is true for the French international broadcaster TV5. TV5 also started with the French perspective on the world and then quickly found out and localized the channel into TV5 Middle East, TV5 Asia, and so on and so forth. The same is true for music channels like MTV. MTV started also with a global approach, but then quickly found out there are musical tastes that are very special in different regions of the world. So this is the reason why we have MTV Europe, we have MTV Middle East, MTV, and so on and so forth. Now Arte, coming back to Arte, still is in this German-French nucleus, but labeling itself European because now they have other European and even extra-European partners. The basic question is, should we renationalize the channel or not? Because I remember some very important discussions that because of these differences in communication behaviors, there was this suggestion of having renationalized windows within the program. For my opinion, it would contradict the European integration idea. But also Arte, today, we have to admit, has also an audience and needs to look after audience research, though even it is a public service channel. But maybe they would address more German spectators if they renationalize some windows of the program, or on the same other side for the French program. Because until now it will closely come to an end. Very important is for Arte, to my opinion, also the differences in competition in the media landscapes of both countries. Because from the very beginning of Arte, we had a ratio between 1 to 4 spectators. 4 spectators in France to 1 in Germany. And this has something to do with the competition of the media landscape. In the very beginning, when Arte first went on the air, there was no such kind of digital broadcasting in France. They had terrestrial broadcasting. I think at that time it was 6 or 7 programs only, and Arte was one of these 6 or 7 programs. Whereas in the beginning, Arte in Germany was one of 30 in the cable. So they had to, in somehow, more competitions in Germany than in France. So Arte was in the beginning, I don't know how it is now, but I think it's still in somehow very similar. They had more spectators for simple competition reasons in France than they did have in Germany at that time. And also linked to this is the basic strategy of what Arte is. European cultural channel. Let me avoid 3 points. I don't know what European is. I don't know what culture is. I somehow have a clue about what a channel is. Yeah? But in the very beginning, the discussions, what is culture in France and what is culture in Germany, was very interesting because in France they said, well, when we say culture, it's not civilization. Culture for us is high culture, like opera, like theater, and these kind of things. Whereas in Germany, when you ask somebody, what do you understand by culture? Culture is put in the more broader sense of the word, including also everyday life culture, eating culture, and so on and so forth. So, on the one hand, you have different understanding of culture, or what the French would call civilization, and what the Germans would call culture. I think also until now, politically speaking, please excuse this cynicism, but oftentimes I have the feeling that if some French people say Europe, they mean France. So they oftentimes in France, and this is also reflected in journalism, have what I call a belly bottom perspective. That means that news items in France are much more oriented to domestic affairs and to international affairs. And in Germany, some years ago it was more international, but it is, I have to admit, it is declining. International reporting also in Germany is declining. When I studied in Paris, it was at the time of the Second Gulf War. Of course I was interested, I put on the television, and I saw lots of French news items, and in the end, if you were lucky, there was a reportage about the Iraq conflict. Because at that time there was a hostage of a young boy in the Auvergne that was dominating all the news items, the news channels. So the different understanding, different competition systems come plus what we have in difference of communication systems. And this actor oftentimes has to, I think, compromise in somehow. But the basic idea is having a transcultural channel that you need to have this compromise. Also when it comes to program content. Arte, it was not an invention of Arte, actually it was an invention by the German second public service channel ZDF to have thematic-oriented evenings, which still is a kind of brand ident of Arte today. You have more than 3-4 hours about one topic, with sometimes discussions, sometimes movies, sometimes documentaries, and so on and so forth. And this is not produced together, but it is given by a German producer or a French producer. And oftentimes, there are topics that are of interest more for Germans, and sometimes there are topics that are more of interest for the French audience. Also one example, there has been, he died some years ago, a very important comedian in somehow, he's a German comedian, he took a French artificial name, which is Loriot. He was very much famous because of his language humor. There has been a thematic evening about Loriot, which was a record breaker on the German side, but has little audience in France. Then another example is there is a famous musician in France called Johnny Holiday. They made a thematic topic evening on Johnny Holiday, which was a record breaker in France, but in Germany nobody really knows who Johnny Holiday is. So let me end with two statements. To my opinion, or to not only to my research, but to the research I did with lots of colleagues inside Europe, is that there are only two topics really transcultural. The first is sport, but Arte is not allowed to do sport according to the treaty. I mean sport in the actual news reporting sense. Background sports is allowed. Sport is the first topic that is possible transculturally, and the second one, what would you guess? What would be of interest to people from Latvia, from Lithuania, from Germany, from Russia, from whatever country? What is of the same interest? Documentaries of animals. Poor lion in the desert, and so on and so forth. There's also another topic, maybe a third topic, that is internationally of relevance and of interest, and this is of course weather. Although it varies of course from one region to the other. Do you have any questions? questions or comments?
I have one, but not to you, but maybe to the audience, because you have been talking about the French example, the German-French example, and maybe at the embassy, every morning we read all the newspapers, and there are Latvian and there are Russian newspapers, and there are Latvian and Russian channels that one can watch here in Latvia. Maybe you can give a little bit context. Maybe with this theory that Professor Hahn said or told you, maybe you can give a short analysis whether that is also true for those two journalistic cultures.
Well, I think to help you, I forgot Russia to Matthias. Russia also is a kind of low context culture. So communication-wise, you would be much more closer than Germany and France on the scale. By the way, I forgot to say that the US is in the middle because he's US research. And he was undecided where to put it. So again, this is very much closer than Germany and France on the communication side. I think that
the difference between really Russian media and Latvian media are really very widely discussed in Latvia. Your comments?
Well, about the proxemics of Russians, I don't agree about low cultural context because they're like high cultural context about proxemics, if you talk about proxemics. So I think they're more high cultural because I have like a more this contact with the Russians, and I know what kind of people they are, and I wouldn't say that they're low cultural context. Well, in a this praxis.
Yeah. I have to, maybe I can react immediately to that. This is also the problem with the US. The larger the country is, of course, the more variance you have inside the country and the communication system. But according to this scheme, at that time, I would put Russia more on the low context side, although there are differences. Of course, today, because of transculturalism and so on and so forth, again, we cannot say culture is equal to nation, and nation is equal to culture, which was in the 50s of the last century a kind of paradigm. Today we have transcultural phenomena. That means also Germans who find themselves really cool, they do la bise, they say hello to each other, and so on and so forth.
But also you said that it is in comparison, so probably Russia compared to Germany or the US is in some context, but maybe in your opinion, comparing it to the Latvian culture, you would say that this is rather high context culture for in your opinion.
But they're like about, if we talk about proxemics, they're like high culture, high context, they are even with the other countries, not even with the Russians, like Russians with the Russians, but they're like intercultural, like whatever. So it doesn't mean that they are like only high context in only in Russians.
Well, this is relativism, that is comparison. If I have to put all the countries that I will found on this planet on this scale, open and scale, I can only do it by doing it relatively. So, of course, Russia is more high context cultures than Latvia, probably. But in comparison to all the other, I would locate it rather on the low context culture side.
What's your opinion about sport? Maybe I'm talking such as Latvian media and Russian media, and if we are talking about sport.
I would agree that sport can be kind of international kind of thing, because sport usually every country is very, how to say, cheering just their country's team. Like even in Latvia, the most popular thing is hockey, and then is football. And the same is about other countries as well. You know, the France, even though it is some kind of factory worker or some other kind of businessman, he is going to like the same sports team as like everyone. So the sport is very international, and as you know, teams are playing to each other all the time. So people are just following, and if you have one, like Latvia made that channel sportattenders.com, so it's very, very popular, even not just in Riga or somewhere, it's very regional.
But so if we talk about like hockey or about cheerleading, Latvia are good cheerleaders only if we win. But if we talk about losing, we're not. We're like putting us down. But if we talk about Hungary, like Hungary is cheerleading even they are like losing. So there is like comparing between that kind. Yeah, that kind of context is.
Yeah. But I can give you. I mean, the sports topic is very important because when it comes to journalism culture, many journalists, of course, know that sport is a transcultural topic, one out of two. The other one is animal, but many journalists are not that much interested into animals, so they are doing the sports-wise. Sometimes this idea of sport reporting is also transferred to other topics. I remember when the Pope, who resigned just some days ago, when he has been elected on the Peter's Place in Rome, people from different countries behaved like if it was a soccer final, raising flags and so on and so forth. And when Benedetto was elected, coming from Germany, the Bild-Zeitung, the German popular yellow press, titled, "We are Pope." And some days, when he announced his resignment, they titled, "We have been Pope." So playing with the idea of, I'm not talking about nationalism or patriotism or something like this, but playing with the idea of sports reporting in order to maybe help emerge a public sphere or a common public sphere.
But even though international topics could be as well as religion and racism, because these topics are like, I would really read if some kind of racism wars or something would start. So that could be as same as like 2 more points, which is like the safe place for journalism sometimes.
Just because it would be interesting. That's it. It's nothing good about it, but it's just would be interesting.
You will reach audience.
Yes, that is the point.
And I would say that it depends on sports actually, because sports in itself are not so transnational. For instance, I mean, soccer, I mean, it's very popular in Germany and in France, but hockey, for instance, is very popular in India, but it is not so popular in France actually. So if there is no hockey matches which are broadcasted live, I mean, on the French TV actually, whereas definitely soccer matches, so depends on sports.
Of course, there are.
By the way, the Latvian soccer player in Germany, Rudnevs, yesterday scored, and he was very big in the news in Germany. Latvia's player scoring for the Hamburg SC. But I didn't see anything in the news here.
Yeah, I do agree with you. That of course there are some local specialities in sports, like different games and so on and so forth. But we also witnessed a very successful channel, which is the 3rd European channel. Not Euronews, not Arte, but Eurosport. And Eurosport is also broadcasting specialities, let's call them as such, in sports to different countries with very much success. So, I mean, if you are a hockey fan coming from a country where hockey does not have this important role, they immediately would turn on and tune to Eurosport. because there you have it. Like playing golf, for example, became a very famous thing in Germany, whereas some years ago it was considered to be a bourgeois elite thing and so on and so forth, and there has been not that much news reporting in sport reports, and then people switched to Eurosport. Now it developed into a more popular sports culture, and there you find now also in the general interest sports reports about hockey and so on and so forth. So sometimes I would say quote-unquote exotic sports can become very popular in other countries as well because of the idea of sport.
Some question? Okay, second. And break till half. For 7